The cave was not where ancient humans lived. This is the first thing to correct because the popular image of prehistoric humans as cave dwellers living permanently inside caves, sleeping on rock floors, painting walls by firelight as their primary domestic activity is wrong in ways that matter for understanding the actual story. Caves were used extensively. The archaeological evidence for human cave use is rich, detailed, and extends back hundreds of thousands of years. The Lascaux paintings, the Altamira bison, the handprint stencils of Sulai, the Hearth's Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. These are not the marks of people who happen to pass through. They are the products of sustained human engagement with cave environments. In some cases, over very long periods, but engagement with a cave is not the same as a permanent residence in a cave. And when you look at the actual evidence for how caves were used versus how open-air sites were used and what drove the balance between the two, over the long arc of human prehistory, the story that emerges is considerably more interesting than the cave dweller cliché suggests. The question of why ancient humans abandoned caves is actually the wrong question. The right question, the one that leads somewhere interesting, is why cave use declined relative to other shelter options as humans developed more sophisticated technology and social organization. And the answer to that question reveals something fundamental about what human intelligence is and how it changes the relationship between a species and its environment. Let's go through it properly. Start with what caves actually offered, because the advantages of natural cave shelter are real and significant, and explain why cave use was so widespread for so long. A cave provides shelter without construction. The rock overhead keeps rain off. The walls block wind. The earth at depth maintains a temperature that is cool in summer and relatively warm in winter. The thermal mass of the surrounding rock buffers temperature extremes in ways that open-air environments cannot. A cave entrance that faces away from the prevailing wind and the direction of worst weather provides the most basic protection available in the landscape without any investment of labor or material. For a mobile foraging group operating with limited carrying capacity, this matters. Every resource a group carries costs energy to transport. A shelter that exists in the landscape and requires nothing to use is a resource that doesn't have to be carried or constructed. In environments with available caves, using them made immediate energetic sense. Caves also provided defensibility. A cave entrance narrows the approach. Predators or rival groups cannot surround a cave using group the way they can surround a group sleeping in the open. The entrance can be monitored, defended, and if necessary, blocked. For groups without constructed fortifications, a cave entrance represented a natural defensive asset that reduced the vigilance cost of nighttime rest. And then there is fire. A fire inside a cave reflects heat off the walls and ceiling in a way that a fire in the open air cannot. The cave concentrates radiated heat, making a smaller fire more effective for warming a group than an equivalent fire in the open. In cold climates, this thermal efficiency of fire inside an enclosed space made caves dramatically more effective as thermal refugia than any open-air alternative available before sophisticated shelter construction. These advantages are why cave use was so persistent and so widespread. They are also why the shift away from caves, when it came, required something that caves could not provide, something that was worth trading these advantages for. Now, let's talk about the limitations of caves, because every advantage of the cave comes paired with a corresponding disadvantage. And understanding the disadvantages is the key to understanding why cave use declined. Caves are fixed in location. You can't move a cave. A group whose food resources require them to range across a large area following seasonal prey migrations. Exploiting different plant resources at different times of year cannot always time their movements to coincide with cave availability. The landscape's distribution of caves is determined by geology, not by food resource distribution. A good foraging territory may have no caves or caves in the wrong locations, or caves that face in thermally disadvantageous directions. This mobility constraint was not a trivial limitation for highly mobile foraging groups. The core advantage of the foraging lifestyle, the ability to move to where resources are rather than waiting for resources to come to you, is compromised by attachment to fixed locations. Caves, for all their shelter advantages, imposed a degree of location fixing that conflicted with the flexible mobility that foraging required. Caves are also shared with other species, not by invitation.
Hyenas, lions, bears, leopards. The large predators of Platoan environments had the same calculation about the advantages of cave shelter that humans had. Archaeological sites routinely show evidence of alternating human and carnivore occupation. Human stone tools and carnivore bones in the same layers, sometimes with evidence of conflict, sometimes with evidence of sequential occupation, as each species displaced or avoided the other in turn. Securing a cave against large carnivores was not always possible, and losing the cave meant losing the shelter investment entirely. The cave environment also has health costs that are easily overlooked in retrospect. Caves are damp. Respiratory conditions thrive in damp, enclosed environments. Parasites that live in soil and organic matter, ticks, fleas, intestinal parasites, accumulate in cave floors that are used repeatedly over time. The accumulation of waste products in cave floors, human, animal, and organic food waste, creates pathogen concentrations that become more dangerous as the occupation density and duration increase. Cave floors that have been used intensively for long periods are not hygienic environments by any measure. And caves are not where the food is. A group based in a cave still has to leave the cave every day to forage, to hunt, to gather water, to collect fuel for fire. The cave is the sleeping and weather refuge location, not the activity location. Every day of cave-based life involves a return journey from wherever the day's activities took the group back to the cave. If the day's activities take the group far from the cave, the return journey is long. The fixedness of the cave imposes that return journey, whether or not it is efficient for that day's particular foraging pattern. Now, let's talk about what replaced the cave, the constructed shelter, and why its development was one of the most consequential technological transitions in the entire prehistory of the species. Constructed shelter is a shelter you can put where you need it. This is the core advantage, and it is enormous. A group that can build a shelter, even a simple windbreak, even a crude lintel of branches and hides, can sleep comfortably in any location its foraging strategy takes it to. The optimal campsite is no longer constrained by geological accident. It is wherever the group decides it should be. The oldest confirmed constructed shelters date to approximately 400,000 years ago at the site of Terra Amata in France. Post holes and stone arrangements that suggest a simple windbreak or lintel structure. More secure evidence comes from Ohalo II in Israel, approximately 23,000 years ago, where the remains of 6 brush huts have been found, preserved by charming with hearths, stone tools, and plant remains that indicate a structured, organized campsite. This was not a cave. It was a deliberately planned settlement in a location chosen for its resources, the shores of the Sea of Galilee, rather than its geological features. The development of constructed shelter required both technological capability, the ability to cut, shape, and assemble materials into stable structures, and the organizational complexity to coordinate the construction effort across multiple individuals. Simple windbreaks require little coordination. More substantial structures, the mammoth bone dwellings found at sites in Ukraine and Russia dating to approximately 15,000 years ago, whose construction required the organized assembly of hundreds of heavy bones into a stable framework, require significant planning, labor coordination, and probably social institutions that assign roles and manage the cooperative work. The mammoth bone dwellings are particularly significant evidence because they demonstrate constructed shelter not as a minimal substitute for cave shelter, but as an actively superior alternative. These structures were built in the open steppe of Eastern Europe in an environment with no caves at all. In conditions of genuine cold climate severity, the people who built them were not making do without caves. They were creating shelter that met their needs, perhaps better than caves would have, because the location of the dwelling was chosen for its proximity to mammoth hunting grounds rather than its geological accident. Now, let's talk about fire, because the relationship between fire technology and shelter technology is central to understanding why cave use declined. Fire inside a cave is effective, but dangerous. The same characteristics that make a cave concentrate heat also make it concentrate smoke. A fire inside an enclosed cave with limited ventilation produces smoke concentrations that are damaging to respiratory health with sustained exposure. Archaeological evidence of hearths in caves and cave hearths are very well documented. Shows consistent evidence that fire management in caves required careful positioning near the cave entrance, where airflow could carry smoke out.
The most thermally effective position for a fire deeper in the cave against the back wall is also the position with the worst smoke ventilation. The development of more sophisticated fire management, understanding draft, positioning fires optimally for both warmth and ventilation. Building structures that directed airflow was easier to implement in constructed shelters than in caves. A constructed shelter can be designed with ventilation in mind. A cave's ventilation characteristics are fixed by its geology. The flexibility of constructed shelter allowed fire management to be optimized in ways that cave environments simply couldn't accommodate. Now, let's talk about something that is rarely discussed in accounts of the cave to constructed shelter transition, but that the social dynamics of human groups make important. The specific advantages of constructed shelter for the social organization of groups that were becoming larger and more complex. Caves come in fixed shapes and sizes. The space inside a cave is determined by the geology that formed it. You cannot expand a cave laterally or add a room when the group grows larger. A group that outgrows its cave has no option but to find a larger cave, split into smaller groups that each use separate caves or deal with the overcrowding that the fixed cave geometry imposes. Constructed shelters are scalable. A group that grows larger can build more shelter, can expand existing structures, can add ancillary structures for storage or for specific activities that benefit from separation from the main living space. The flexibility of construction applies not just to location, but to scale and organization. Constructed settlements can be designed to accommodate the social structure of the group rather than requiring the group to adapt its social structure to whatever the cave's geometry offers. This scalability became increasingly important as human groups developed more complex social structures, more elaborate divisions of labor, and more differentiated use of space for different activities. The workshop function, specialized space for tool production, hide processing, or other manufacturing activities, is documented at constructed open-air sites in ways that it rarely is in cave sites, suggesting that the spatial organization of activity was more deliberate and more differentiated in constructed settlements than in cave environments. Let's also address something that is almost entirely absent from popular accounts of the cave to shelter transition, but that the archaeological evidence consistently points toward the role of clothing and bedding in reducing the thermal advantage that caves previously provided. The development of tailored fitted clothing documented in the archaeological record through bone needles and indirectly through lice genetics that place body lice divergence at approximately 170,000 years ago significantly changed the human thermal equation. A person wearing well-fitted layered clothing in a constructed shelter with a well-managed fire was thermally protected against conditions that would have been dangerous to an insufficiently clothed person in a cave without fire. As clothing technology improved, as needlework became more sophisticated, as multiple layers of fitted garments became standard, the thermal advantage that the cave's rock mass provided became less decisive relative to the advantages of constructed shelters' flexibility. Bedding materials, specifically the use of prepared plant materials and hides as sleeping surfaces and coverings, worked in the same direction. Archaeological evidence of prepared sleeping surfaces at open-air sites is documented as early as 200,000 years ago at Sibidu Cave in South Africa, where layered plant bedding was found with evidence of intentional fire use to sanitize the sleeping area. This evidence suggests that the quality of the sleeping environment in constructed shelters was actively managed in ways that competed with or exceeded what cave floors naturally offered. Let's talk about agriculture, because agriculture is often cited as the primary driver of cave abandonment and the shift to constructed permanent settlements. And while this is partially true, it is a significant oversimplification that misrepresents the timeline. The shift away from caves was substantially underway long before agriculture. The constructed shelter traditions documented at Wellow II and at Mammoth bone-dwelling sites in Eastern Europe predate agriculture by thousands of years. Hunter-gatherer groups in multiple environments were using constructed shelters as their primary shelter form, while remaining fully mobile and fully dependent on wild food sources. The cave was already declining as the dominant shelter form before the first field was ever planted. What agriculture did was change the scale and permanence of constructed settlement, not initiate it. Agricultural communities required permanent structures because permanent settlement was the agricultural lifestyle's defining feature. You cannot harvest a field you abandoned months ago to follow a herd. The permanent, substantial constructed buildings of early agricultural villages represent a continuation and intensification of a shelter. Construction tradition that was already established applied to a new lifestyle that required permanence in ways that mobile foraging did not. The earliest confirmed architecture, structures that appear to have been purpose-built for functions beyond simple weather protection, appears at Göbekli in southern Turkey approximately 12,000 years ago, arguably just before or at the transition to agriculture in that region. The massive stone pillars arranged in circles at Göbekli were almost certainly not domestic dwellings. They are too large, too labor-intensive, and too ceremonially elaborated to serve simply as shelter. They represent the application of construction technology to social and ritual purposes, which is itself significant evidence that construction capability had developed well beyond the minimum required for shelter. Now let's talk about the cultural dimension, because caves were not just shelter. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules. 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube, what they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus, an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. They were also ritual spaces, communication spaces, and the location of some of the most significant cultural production in the entire Paleolithic record. And this cultural use of caves, distinct from their shelter use, tells its own story about why humans remained engaged with caves even as the shelter function declined. The cave paintings of Western Europe at Chauvet, at Lascaux, at Altamira, at Neo, at dozens of other sites were not made in the parts of the caves where people slept. They were made deep in cave systems, in chambers far from the entrance, in darkness that required carried light to navigate and to paint. The people who made these paintings were not painting their bedrooms. They were going into places that were not domestic spaces, were not, in most cases, shelter spaces, to create images and contexts of deliberate separation from ordinary life. The cave as ritual space is a different use from the cave as shelter, and its persistence long after cave shelter was being replaced by constructed alternatives reflects the cave's specific properties as a ritual environment. The darkness is absolute. The silence is profound. The separation from the outdoor world is complete. The cave offers a quality of environmental separation from ordinary reality that constructed spaces rarely replicate. These properties, irrelevant to the shelter function, are highly relevant to the ritual function, to the creation of altered states, to the experience of connection with something beyond ordinary. Experience, to the production of imagery and symbol in contexts designed to register significance. This cultural use of caves continued in some regions, intensified even as shelter use declined. The most extensive cave painting traditions in Europe reached their peak Not in the earliest periods of cave use, but in the later Paleolithic between approximately 20,000 and 14,000 years ago, at a time when constructed shelter was well established, and the practical shelter advantages of caves were no longer compelling for many groups. People were going into caves to create culture, at exactly the time they were leaving caves as domestic spaces. The specific properties of deep cave environments that make them powerful ritual spaces, absolute darkness, acoustic resonance, spatial complexity that requires navigation and exploration, the complete sensory separation from the outside world are properties that were probably understood and valued long before the paintings themselves were made. The cave's ritual significance may have preceded its ritual use as a painting space, expressed in ways that left less durable evidence than pigment on stone. The acoustic dimension of cave painting sites has been examined by researchers who found that the caves most heavily painted were also the caves with the most striking acoustic properties. Chambers where sound echoes in unusual and dramatic ways, where a single voice produces multiple reverberations, where drumming or chanting creates sound environments that are dramatically different from outdoor acoustics. Whether this correlation reflects deliberate selection of acoustically significant spaces for ritual purposes, or whether both the acoustic properties and the visual art reflect a general interest in the cave's capacity to produce unusual sensory experiences, the correlation itself is striking and suggests that cave engagement was about more than the rock face as a painting surface. Now let's close with what this arc from cave use to cave abandonment to continued cultural engagement with caves reveals about what makes humans different from every other species. Every other species that uses caves uses them as shelter. That is the function. The cave provides protection and the animal uses the protection. The function is direct and transparent. Humans used caves for shelter, then developed technology that made shelter independent of caves, then continued using caves for purposes that had nothing to do with shelter. They went back into the darkness to paint pictures that they could not see without light. They had to carry in places where no one might find the paintings for 10,000 years, for reasons that remain partially opaque, even with the benefit of extensive archaeological analysis. This is the distinctively human pattern using an environment not just for its immediate functional advantages, but for the experiences, meanings, and symbolic productions that the environment enables, and then moving on when a better functional solution exists while retaining the environment that was functionally superseded for its experiential qualities. Ancient humans didn't abandon caves. They outgrew their need to live in them while recognizing that caves offered something that the constructed home, for all its advantages of location and flexibility and hygiene, could not provide. A constructed shelter is where you sleep. A cave, as it turned out, was where something else happened entirely.